Hello, world. Welcome to the Speed Strength Show. I'm Tommy.
And I'm Christian. And if you could be the best in the world at any single skill, what would it be?
Oh, skill.
Yeah.
This came up in practice the other day, but we were talking about what sport, if you could be the
Mm.
best at a particular sport, what would it be? But skill.
Yeah. So, like, think of if you're a basketball player, you could be the best dribbler in the world, or the best jumper in the world, or the
Oh, the best
best
skill.
sprinter.
I'm thinking beyond the sports world now. I'm thinking like
Where's your mind
life.
going? Oh, and it could be anything. And that's the context of the
Yeah,
question. Like,
yeah,
it could be
that's what I'm
life.
saying.
Yeah.
Like, how can I be like what would make me the best possible person? Or what would, it would it that's yeah, my mind was immediately leaving the sport realm going
Yeah.
sport is not really that important when you think of like all the global
Oh, no.
um, demands of life and skills and abilities you can have. It's important for us because we're in it, but you know, I'd much rather be super smart than you know be the you know highest jumper in the world or something like that.
I mean, we're smart, but we're not sending people to space.
No, exactly. Yeah, NASA's not hiring us to you know put people on Mars or something like that. Um, I would have to think I'm thinking something knowledge or
Yeah.
communication based. So that way, every time somebody left a conversation with you, like that has to be the smartest person in the world.
They just leave.
Like their,
Wow. They're like, oh my God.
yeah, their mind just operates differently. I don't know what I would pick. Maybe it would be a personality trait where you just like, you
Mm.
are invincible or impervious to anybody else's thoughts. Because I
Like
find
your
there's a lot of
head's
time,
down.
yeah, like, because I'm thinking like, what if if you look at all the major revolutions, breakthroughs,
Yeah.
technological advances, people coming up with ideas, it's someone coming up with something where probably a large group of people are like, ah, that's pretty stupid.
Yeah. It's in
But
spite of the
then
doubters.
exactly. So I'm wondering if there is I don't know what you would classify it as, but if there's like a mental focus or resiliency to shun the outside haters, the criticism, because then if you had like a wild kind of offbeat, off the rails idea that might be just a completely different way of thinking, you could you would have the confidence and the focus to see something like that through.
Yeah, it's almost like a confidence trait where you're like, "This is my idea, and I know it's good." Like, I don't have to worry about people being like, "Oh, it's not gonna work out." Like, that confidence in
Yeah.
that.
Or you don't know if it's good or not, but you're
Yeah,
willing, you have the confidence to see it through. And then if it doesn't
yeah,
work, you're like, wow, that was stupid. I'll try again. But I'm sure there's a lot of things that haven't even progressed forward because if there was enough negative energy in sort of the infancy of that idea, it gets shut down. It takes a pretty strong and resilient individual to, if 10 people say, hey, this is a stupid thing to do, and you're like, but it might work. I'm going to try it.
well, and it could just be the right person or the wrong person, I guess, saying, "Hey, this is a bad idea." Like, it could be that one person where, like, they're a huge mentor or whatever, and, like, that just shuts down everything. It's like, "Oh, okay, never mind." If they say it's bad, it's probably bad.
Yeah. I just think of that quote. I forget. It was somebody who was, I think Henry Ford had reached out to them to be an investor in Ford as he was trying to start up the factory. And I think the person's response was, the automobile is a fad, the horse is forever.
Mm,
And then didn't want to invest in Ford, which in hindsight is they
terrible
probably
idea.
lost a tremendous amount of money. Um, but you get those types of things where someone's doing something very different, very revolutionary. It's bucking current trends.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I would pick. I don't know what you call it. I don't know what the exact trait would be, but I think I would pick something along the lines of that.
Yeah. Mine's similar in the sense of I'd probably say like mine's the something around the like the business creativity. Like you always see those entrepreneurs out there that are incredibly successful, that just have the knack to come up with genius ideas that work.
Yeah,
There's
it's like
people who are super
intuition.
creative, but it doesn't work. And there's people with that tuition of like, this is going to make them billions of dollars, and they do it and it always works. I don't like, similar to you. Doesn't necessarily have a word for it, but it's probably where I would go with mine as well. Where it's like these little bit more abstract skills that aren't commonly talked about or not necessarily clearly defined.
Yeah, and maybe that's what makes them so difficult to kind of narrow down or find those people until somebody just hits on idea after idea. And it's like this
Yeah,
person who invents things can't miss. Everything they create is a helpful tool. Everything they put together is a system that just is fluid and it works. And then there's other things that are like overly complicated and convoluted, and then it's a dumpster fire every time it gets put together. And but it's hard to tell until you have that track record who
yeah.
has it and who doesn't. But I think that's what I
No,
would want
totally.
to have. Something like that.
Yeah, yeah, like someone who could do that regardless of what's going on externally.
Yeah, because I think that would serve you well in several avenues of life,
I mean, you see a few billionaires like that that are just unapologetically doing things.
for better or for worse.
Yeah, for better or for worse, but you do see that like it's not a confidence, but kind of a confidence.
Yeah. And so I feel like that would, whatever you wanted to do,
Yeah,
doesn't necessarily have to be leading a business and trying to build a billion, $1 trillion empire, but it could just be, you're going to coach differently. You're going to
yeah,
be a school teacher and you're going to teach different. You're going to, try to, change the way that you approach your medical practice or your,
yeah.
whatever your role or your passion is. I think there's a degree of confidence in shunning out, I don't want to say critical feedback because critical feedback is helpful, but
Mhm.
the just for no good reason negative
We
feedback or
just
the haters, because that will pull people back or restrict them from
yeah,
reaching their potential. So I think that's why I would pick that, because then I could still be doing things that I was passionate
yeah,
about, but I would probably be better at doing anything that I was doing that I was passionate about.
yeah. Like there's always that noise around you surrounding whatever you're doing, whether it's from other people in the practice, other people who are like from the product itself, whether it's things that you see out there, like, oh, that person does this. Like, there's always that noise around you. And it's like, oh, I could do that, or I could do this, versus knowing, hey, I need to do that. This is the path. And be able to filter out and block out some of that noise that may just muddy the waters versus actually constructively help you. I think is the difference that you're kind of referring to there.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that would be my pick. Like that's my final answer. Don't know what I'm calling it, but I'm locking it in. And, you know, I wish I had that, but this is not a fantasy world where we can do that. I'll try my best in my everyday practice, but that's what I think I would pick.
Step one starts now, Tommy.
Yeah, I'm shutting out all the haters. I'm never going to talk to anybody ever again. Just be in my own mind, and then I can't be corrupted by anyone's thoughts.
But yeah, I would say like mine's definitely that creativity skill, that invariable good creativity that happens out there.
Yeah, and I think, you kind of have to be
Yeah.
creative, I think, within, what we do with coaching and programming
Oh
and
yeah.
trying to find a way to make people better. I think there's an inherent level of creativity you probably need. And even more so, I think, when you start to explore what we'll talk about today is, working with Parasport. I
Yeah.
think even that requires an even a step above with the creativity, because some of the traditional or well practiced, tried and true methods may not be feasible depending on the constraints that you're dealing with. So I know I'm sure you've had your fair share of creative
Oh yeah.
kind of workarounds with Parasport and things like that. But I think this will be a good one today. Kind of talk about something a little bit different.
Yeah. I'm excited about, and the creativity piece is pretty accurate because I remember when I first got working with para athletics specifically, I didn't realize how broad the classification system for para-athletics is compared to most other
There's
para sport.
there's so many.
Well, and essentially, like any impairment that exists for the most part, like there's a classification on the para end in
Yep.
athletics and specifically, whereas rugby is specifically wheelchair rugby or wheelchair basketball, or goalball is only VI athletes, or
Yes.
swimming is pretty broad, I think, as well. Like they've got a fairly large classification system, but most other para sports are one or two categories, maybe three. Whereas if you
Yeah.
look at athletics, they've got six six different classifications, but within each classification there's two to three layers within them as well. Like it's so all encompassing.
Yeah. Which I think is a great thing because then, it, it it's open and it allows for basically anybody who wants to
Yeah.
compete in track and field or athletics as they call it everywhere else in the world. Um, you can compete in it and
Yeah.
you can compete at a high level. You can go to the Paralympics, you can go to a world championships, you can do everything that the sport has to offer, which I think is you know, one of the reasons why I think probably track and field as a whole is doing a very good job.
Yeah.
Um, with Parasport because of how open, inviting, and accessible it is because of all the different
Yeah.
classifications that can be made for it.
Yeah, really the only limitation that exists on the para track side is the events themselves. Like not every event is always present. You are missing a couple, but beyond that, like unless you're a para marathon person or want to do the 200-meter, like you're usually pretty set. Or like the 800 meters not doesn't exist either. Or
Yeah,
like you don't have the 3K steeplechase, but beyond a couple of events missing.
I mean, yeah, there's the option for somebody to compete in
Yeah.
probably any event that they want, or they'll at least find something they would be interested in competing in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess those, for anyone who don't know, there's kind of six main classifications for para athletics. How the number system works. So you have a T or an F at the beginning of it. T stands for track, F stands for field. For whatever reason, jumps are in the track versus in the field.
I know, I've
Conversation
always
for a
wondered
later
about that.
bit.
Yeah, that's
And then essentially, the lower the number indicates the less function an individual will have. So if we're talking about the T11 to T13, we're talking about visually impaired athletes. T11 has less vision than T12s and T13. So T13 has the most vision. T11s are guided. So that's where you see your runners with guides. T12 is a hybrid where they've got some have a guide, some run free independently. And T13 is all independent running.
mhm,
You get your T20s, which is intellectual impairment. I believe the definition is an IQ under 75. So a lot of that,
okay.
especially in the endurance side, you're seeing it affects pacing, like pacing strategy. So I
Yeah.
work with the T20 athlete. The conversation after his races is never, oh, I'm just not fit enough to run a 355. It's, ooh, I kicked too early or kicked too late or I kicked way at the beginning of the race. It came out super hot. Like it's always tactical pacing issues is typically what we see with T20s. Um, then you get to the T30 categories, which is coordination impairment. So this is things like cerebral palsy, brain trauma, things like that. You get 34s, which is a wheelchair class in the CP category. You get 36, 37, 38, which are your ambulatory and throwing classes, which again, higher number, more function, and they just have a classification process that works down. Um,
Yeah.
then you get into the 40s, which is upper limb impairment. So that refers to people like congenitally born with like missing an arm or missing part of their arm or missing a hand. And I believe it's 47, 46 are the two of those. So 47, you'd be like most of your arm is really there or has full function. And then I think the 46 is where you would see like someone missing a full arm or missing both arms kind of thing. Then you get to the 50s, which are like your wheelchair racing classes. So you got 51, 52, 53, and 54. And then when you look at the throwing events, you also have a 55.
Yep.
And essentially what differentiates the four racing categories or the throwing categories is how much trunk function comes up, and then also like hand and tricep function. So you look at the 51s, which is the lowest function class, limited to no hand function, almost no tricep function, zero core function and back function. 52s, some hand function. Most of them can hold a glove to hit onto the wheelchair with. But again, no trunk function really. Your 53s have everything but trunk function. And then your 54s have full abdominal function and like some hip function, but essentially just can't walk is the differentiator between them. Um, and then you get your 60s, which is your blade runners.
Yeah.
So and that's where you're going. It's above and below is the classification. So whether you have one or two blades doesn't matter. It's are the blades below the knee or above the knee. It's kind of the differentiator between those ones. So those are your main meat and potato classifications of track and field.
Yeah, and you can see as we're talking about, you look at something. I'll compare it. Like we had Molly on the show about
Yeah.
35 episodes, and she works with seated volleyball. So in volleyball, you have standing volleyball and seated volleyball, and maybe there's another type of volleyball that I'm not aware of. It was only seated because she works with the
Yeah.
seated team. But you got seated or standing. Okay, that's your pick. And now you're in track and field and you go, okay, here's the 30 different classifications we have and all the numbers and what it means. And like, I don't know, I'd be curious. I think disclaimer, put this out there. You work with a lot more para athletes than I do. So your experience is going to be a little bit broader. You work with many more coaches that work with para athletes. My experience now working with para is kind of case study type thing, like N of 2 or something like that.
Yeah.
So very very small numbers I'm working with. So you probably have a better perspective from a broader focus, having worked with and working with more athletes in parasport is where mine, like I said, I would describe more of a case study on my
Mm-hmm.
end, where it's individuals here and there. Um, but was there anything that you were like not worried about, but like, because I don't know, were you aware of the classification system before you got in, or not really?
Not at all. So when I came in the
Okay, so
interview,
that's where I wasn't sure if that was like when you
yeah,
saw all the list, if that was daunting for you as a coach, going like, oh, I had no idea there was this many classifications. Like, what am I getting into?
well, and what differentiates them was the biggest piece. Like that was so I remember when I came into the interview for this job, they kind of asked me like, "Hey, you have zero para experience. How are you gonna figure it out?" Like, and like my answer was, I don't know. Every athlete's a puzzle. Just gonna figure it out. Like it's one of those things of para is just a different piece of a puzzle that's a little bit more unique than what you typically see in able-bodied sport. But at the end of the day, every athlete's got their nuances that makes them a little bit different, whether it be injury history or whatever that is. So that was my approach to it. Okay, it's just a puzzle to figure out. It doesn't change how I approach it. And again, that was a big piece until you start seeing people within the same event and classification, you don't really understand the difference. So we have two people in the T30 categories. One's a 37, one's a 38. They're both 1500-meter runners. And that was the first time I really had that, oh, this is the difference between the classification moments. Because you see them run together, you see them lift together, you see them do all these very adjacent type activities. And that's where you see the difference in function and capacity relative to they're both coordination athletes, but the difference between a 38 and a 37 is pretty apparent. Like you watch them run, especially, and you're like, oh, okay. Like I see the difference now. I get why the two classes exist because one looks very smooth, not quite as much of like the stiffness and rigidity you see from CP sometimes. Whereas in the 37, like you're seeing the one really rigid side, and one side's got this nice bounce, but the other side's a little bit heavier and flatter. Versus the 38s don't have that same contrast between left and right that you would typically see. Theirs is more of a fatigue response. So I know the 138 guy, um, when he gets really fatigued during like really high intensity work, that's when it starts to appear and come out. So that's when you start noticing like, oh, you had a hard session yesterday on the track. Oh yeah, I can tell like you're a little bit stiffened on the one side kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought of, I mean, parasport in a way that's no different than comparing sport to sport or coaches to coaches. I think this came up way back, and almost every time if I have a conversation with somebody about what makes a great coach, well, whether you're a basketball coach or a volleyball coach or a track and field coach or whatever, 95% of coaching is exactly the same. The traits that make a great coach great are not always the X's and O's of the sport,
Yeah,
right? And so I've always kind of taken the same lens with parasport that
yeah,
there is much more similar than there is different. And I think this is probably even truer in track
absolutely.
and field in the sense that you are still working with athletes. These individuals are competitive, they are driven, there are things that they are good at, there are things that they are not good at. There are, there's injury history they deal with. There is, all of the puzzle pieces that you're kind of putting together, whether it's basketball, volleyball, whatever. There's always so much that's similar. And I think
Yeah,
even in track and field, when you compare, the events, whether it's like you said, parasport classification or not, if I have a seated thrower, the goal is still to throw the implement as far in the sector as possible. The goal of the event hasn't changed. And so I always think back to kind of the quote about, you know, the principles remain, but your methods change.
yeah,
So very much in the case of athletics or track and field, whether you're working with an Olympian or a Paralympian, doesn't matter in the sense that the demands of the sport and the principles are, I'm going to say,
yeah,
in most cases, staying true. The goal is still to get from the start to the finish as fast as you can, to jump as
yeah.
far in the pit as you can. Um, Again, the principles haven't changed. Maybe based on the classification or who you're working with, the methods may change. And that's where I think there's a little bit of difference and you have to get creative. But for the most part, it, it's not really that different. You're working with driven competitive athletes that want to do the best in their sport.
Yeah.
And your role as a coach is there to guide them, figure out the sport. What do they have? What do they don't have? Try to promote what they have, give them what they don't have, and let them be the best athlete they can be.
Yeah, we still develop capacities and skills just like you would any other athlete, right? Like there's still skills we can develop that will improve their technical model in their sport. There's still capacities that you'll develop that will improve the technical model of their sport. Just so you have to just throw stuff further or go faster, chair, run fast. Like it's the exact same thing, essentially. And yeah, just the methods need to be adapted versus like depending on the classification, essentially.
Yeah, or even what works and what doesn't work for them, which again is no different than, any other athlete that you're working with. Like in my case, because it's, a couple of people kind of sprinkled in amongst the larger group.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if they're still training with the people in their event area.
Yeah.
So in this case, I'm going, well, the event is the same. If it's a sprint, it's A to B as fast as you can. If it's a jump, it's jump as far as you can. If it's a throw as far as you can. And so the structure or the overall skeleton of the sessions I've created doesn't really change. And it's just, oh, okay, you prefer to do this over that. Okay, then let's put that exercise in
Yeah.
for our, you know, the exercise we're going to use to develop power, or an exercise we're going to use to clean up an asymmetry, or a hip dominant lift, or whatever it happens to be. The skeleton structure remains. The principles, the fundamental things you're trying to accomplish remain. You're just going about them a different way.
Oh, totally. That
And I
that
don't know
that,
if
that
that's been
really
your
is
experience as well.
100%. So I say like the biggest contrast, like I've had to express that point. We have two wheelchair athletes in our hub right now. One's a T34, so coordination athlete, um, fully ambulatory. I believe the only inhibited function he has is to his lower limbs. So he just can't walk with what would be like a typical gait. He'll use a day chair. They kind of talked about like day chair competition and stuff like that. So he's not walking around fatiguing himself because walking is not very efficient for him. Versus a T51 athlete who's got no hand function, no core function, limited shoulder function. Um, Training between those two athletes is starkly contrasted in terms of how it flows. So our T34 athlete, I build the session, it can have, supersets, triple sets, quad sets, and he can move from station to station really easily and really accessibly. That's not an issue at all for him because he can walk around and go from indoors to outdoors to the chair. So we've done triple sets where it's, hey, bench, med ball throw, then an uphill sprint in his racer, and that's his triple set because he has no issue moving from A to B. Versus our T51 athlete, and we talked about this a bit before the call, our gym is not very para-friendly. We have lots of ledges, lots of lips. Everything's dark. So if you have VI issues, it's hard to see the lips. Our cable stacks are in a corner and it's all compressed and not very mobile. So for T51 athlete, like I've got to stack 25 kilo plates into the cable stack to hold his chair in place. His chair doesn't have brakes because it's a rugby chair because it used to be a wheelchair rugby guy and he's transferred over to athletics. So I'm stacking plates to hold his chair in place. But because he's got no core function, I'm putting him to like a wrestling snap down or like seat belting behind his back to hold him into the posture that I want him to. And then I also have to feed him the handles so he can't grab them on his own. So the work and kind of messing around, especially in our space with him, is a lot more intensive. And we also can't just hop between 2 or 3 different exercises throughout the gym because the setup in each space is so unique depending on what's going on. So for him, the flow of the workout is very much, hey, we're going to set up this station, maybe do it with a med ball so you can just like pop back and forth between. But then it's tough in our space. If he's set up on a cable stack, he actually can't get in and out of that space anymore because of all the different tips and led those sets, move on. Finish all those sets, move on. So the flow for him is very different than someone who's ambulating around.
Well, yeah, and again, and I think those are I don't want to say the small challenges because that's obviously something that could tremendously hamper the session where,
Yeah.
in this case, an individual's having difficulty because of how the space was built, navigating around and getting from
Yeah.
one thing to the next. Um, but you start programming where, like you said, okay, this is what we want to do. We do all of it, and when we're done, we'll move to the next thing, and then we'll do that.
Yeah.
We'll do all of it. We'll move to the next thing. Does it, maybe limit some of your options, like you said, to pair or potentiate things? Yeah, a little bit. But at the end of the day, you're still able to get the work done. That would be no different than in any other space where you'd have perhaps like equipment limitation or environmental
Yeah.
constraints that don't let you do whatever. Like for any athlete I have right now, we can't really pair med ball work with anything because our
Yeah.
weight room is built under bleachers. So we have a slanted roof on a 45-degree angle. And so we don't actually have the ceiling space to throw a med ball
Yeah.
vertically because we would take out the ceiling. And we have a very, very expensive projector in there, which if somebody hit would cost us tens of thousands of dollars. And we don't have the space like horizontally or depth wise
Yeah.
to do. I mean, I guess we could, but you'd have to like, okay, everybody stand off to the side. This person's going to throw the med ball forward. Don't get in the way. Like it's not feasible. So again, I think that's where, the idea that you just got to get, I know it's easy to say you just got to get creative, but I mean, these are things that I think probably more coaches than not probably have some of these skill sets and probably have the
Yeah.
creative solutions and workarounds because at the end of the day you're going to find you know barriers or challenges to
Yeah.
your uh I guess what did Cole talk about in the last episode? He said there's like the dream scenario and then realistically
Yeah.
the best that you can put together with what you got, and that's that's something you have to do everywhere you go. You're never going to have the perfect
Yeah.
world. So, at the end of the day, you're still finding a way to train all
Yeah.
the athletes you're working with to the principles that kind of govern the sport and the performance in the sport.
Well, and pragmatically, just understanding how the facility matches the flow and matches the group of the session. And I think this is a huge value of if you've only ever been in one sport in one location, going out and just seeing different sports in different locations is so valuable, right? Like you and I have had the lucky, like you've worked at Waterloo and then McMaster and then U of A and then private sector and then Guelph again. Like you've seen all these different groups in different facilities, and that's so valuable. Like the difference between being at U of A, where you're at 10,000 square feet and unlimited space, to then like when I went to the high school, I think we had a shoebox of 1,500 square feet with 75 people in it at a time. Sessions are just built differently. It's just understanding that flow, and it's no different than that. It's just like understanding, okay, what were limitations to space? What are the limitations to the group? How do we make things flow nice and just make it work? Whether that's textbook or ideal, it doesn't really matter. It's just figuring out pragmatically, like how can I get our menu items checked? How can we
Well,
tick the boxes we need to tick in a way that's flowing and functional and not a headache?
and you're probably going to have some trial and error.
Oh, totally.
And like I know I have a little bit, but I mean, it's one of those things where, and then once you're kind of in it, once you're working with the individuals, it's like anybody else. You get to know the people, you get
Yeah.
to know what is working for them, what is not working for them, what their preferences are, what their preferences are not. um I mean, we're fortunate to have a bunch of training options available. There are athletes I work with that love our Kaiser
Yeah.
machines, and I might not be able to pull them back over to the weightlifting side because they
Hmm.
love seeing the number pop up every time. I got people who are the opposite,
Yeah.
that if they have the chance to get off the Kaiser and do weightlifting instead, they'd love to see those machines thrown out the facility window.
Yeah.
And so, at the end of the day, you start to work through some things and you go, okay, I got an idea, with this, or I got an idea with that. Let's try it. And then oh yeah, this works really well. I like this. Okay, perfect. That's an option now on the training menu. Oh, it didn't work. Okay, we'll scrap that one. We'll come up with some different ideas.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the fun part of it. But it's also, like I said, something that I think is present in coaching in general. And
Yeah.
so, it maybe visually appears very different, right? If you're watching,
Yeah.
somebody race down the track in a wheelchair versus run, like visually, it's, oh, well, that person is seated and they're wheeling their way down the track. That person
Yeah.
is running down the track. Yeah, biomechanically, there's probably a lot of differences in the movement and the muscles being used and et cetera, et cetera. But again, your training principles haven't changed. The fundamental goal in the sport hasn't changed. There's still a component of, it's not stride length, stride frequency, obviously, in
Yeah.
a wheelchair, but there is a rate at which you are turning the wheels, and there is distance being covered the same way in stride length, stride frequency, and those are the principles that would govern your speed. And so I think that's, like, to me, a big part of it is kind of helping remove some of the barriers, because I think
Yeah.
as humans we just tend to take notice of the things that are different.
Yeah.
And even if one thing is different and nine things are the same, sometimes we have a tendency to ignore the nine things that are
Yeah.
the same, and we kind of fixate on the thing that's different. So, at least in my experience, which again is more small case studies here and there, N of one over here, N of one over there, it's that's been my experience, that much more is the same than different. And it's no
100%.
different than any other coaching I've done, where I have to just, you get creative with the principles and the things that govern the
Yeah.
sport.
Oh, totally. I 100% agree with that idea of there is more that's the same than there is ever different, right? Like, and that's a huge piece that underpins that. Um, and they're still working towards a technical model of performance. You're still splitting hairs of, oh, if we do this slightly differently, or if we do that slightly differently, how does it influence performance? And I think right now in Parasport, we're in such a golden well of performance. Like we've seen the last 3 years, there's been world records set every single worlds in most events now. And it's a really exciting part of being that sport is like you're at this cutting edge of, I think the popularity, and I think it's a couple of different factors, but the popularity of the sport, the awareness of the sport, and the momentum it's built, that we're getting better and better training, better and better athletes, more and more people in it. So we're seeing performances from 5 years ago be beat by like 2 or 3 seconds in a 200 meter, which is nuts.
It's just a massive improvement.
One of the Canadian athletes, he's been in the sport for 12 years. He's still PBing. He's 41 or 42 years old, which is crazy,
Yeah.
right? And especially on like some, like the wheelchair side, I'd say is one of the starkest contrasts because there's so much beyond just the athlete running, for example. And you, the Formula One nerd in you, Tommy, would like this because that is where wheelchair racing is going. So it's very little now about, hey, we're just going to put you in a chair, build a really good physical engine about the person in the chair in a race. But now it's becoming about how do we position you in the chair relative to the wheel? And then what are the parts? And then where is the weight coming from? What's the camber of the wheels relative to how fast it can go around? Like all these elements are starting to come into play now where it's, this is 5% an improvement that stack up on each other to make someone go a second and a half faster around the track in a
Yeah,
400
like
meter or
it's
something like that. Like it's nuts.
well, and I think what's kind of cool for you to be involved. I've never worked with wheelchair athletes, like wheelchair racers like that. And the cool part is that, like you said, it is a little bit like race car driving esque in the sense that every sport for the most part has some technological component.
Yep.
There's an engineering component. But for example, in track and field, as coaches, we're at least in most of my experience, we're so far removed from that engineering side. I'm not building and designing shoes. I'm not building and designing runway or track surfaces or poles or, implements and things like that. But in your experience with like the wheelchair athletes, that's all happening in the same place. Like you said, you're tweaking the chair, you're looking at maybe materials that things could be built out of, how you're positioning people, combining it with the physical performance and all that stuff. So bringing all that stuff together is like, that's pretty cool that
Well, and it
you're
changes everything.
yeah, and you get to be there live for all of it. You're not removed from any of it, whether it's the
No.
kind of the engineering performance or the tactical performance or the athletic physical performance. You're
Yeah.
you, with that in particular, it's all right there for you to have free play with.
Well, and honestly, like for me, from a strength and conditioning end, it's the most involved I've been from a how do we influence a technical model perspective, right? Because the coach has made, so our one athlete, this is our T34 that we talked about earlier, he came to us for the first time last year. And our coach that we're with, our head of para coach, super creative, very much a tinkerer type individual and does amazing work on that front. And he's got a mentor out in Europe where they're exploring a lot of this wheelchair changing stuff. And like, how do we adjust the position of the athlete in the chair relative to the wheel? How do we adjust the camber? All these pieces. So he's made huge sweeping changes to this athlete's technical model. Like the way he's applying force into the wheel is night and day, completely different than how he did before. So then we're going into film with like, hey, this is how he pushed before. This is how he pushes now. This is how we need him to push in this new position. What can we do in the gym that helps teach these skills and enforce these positions that he needs to enter in this new space to be able to apply force properly? Because now we've completely changed his position, but he's pushing into the wheel and applying force the same way he did prior. So now how do we expand his constraints to push into the wheel in this new position to allow him to actually improve performance, right? So that's the piece where we've spent so many times splitting hairs over film of like, okay, like how can we promote this like torso oscillation while it's hitting into the wheel? Because you see this almost like kind of like butterfly swim approach where they come up, they hit into the wheel, the torso goes down, then it raises up and they hit to the wheel and come up.
Yeah, it's like a
He never had that quality before because the position he was in, he was way too upright. So it was all just like arms pushing into the chair with no torso movement. But if you're watching
there's
some of the
probably like a
best
lack of rhythm
athletes,
and flow. It was just like straight
exactly.
muscling their way down the track.
Yeah, it was just like boom, 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 boom. He's really strong, really powerful, but there was no, yeah, rhythm and flow. And if you watch medalists in the T54, the T53, and the 34 class, you see this like flow and rhythm, and it's quite beautiful to watch. Very similar to swimming when you watch them in the water.
But
It's
yeah,
just
when
like
they're under the water and they dolphin kick.
it's this snake-like rhythmic motion, and it's very pretty to watch when it's done really well. So we spent a whole year trying to work on that with this guy and be like, hey, like this is what we want because the torso gives you the lean in. It's the setup to a hard push into the wheel. And so that was the process of like, how do we promote this in the gym beyond just getting strong, right? So it's
Yeah.
connecting those dots between capacity development, improving his the raw engine, but then also influencing the driver behind the car as well as how do we improve your ability to race around the track kind of thing.
Yeah, and so yeah, like to me that's so cool. And again, it's not that different from,
No.
hey, torso posture, spine position, hip position, the central part of our bodies sets up the proximal sets up the distal. And
Yeah.
again, here we're looking at no different. The proximal setup, is allowing distal performance to, kind of be shown. And it's cool that you have all these different experiences because again, you know, like I said, mine are just kind of case studies and they're not, I guess, not as exciting as these ones in the sense that, like there's maybe times of the year where we're focused a little bit more on, trying to, even out imbalances between left and right.
Yeah.
If you have like an affected and a non-affected side and things like that. And obviously early in the base season, you know, the the more that you can begin
Yeah.
to bridge the gap with that, then that improves running performance and jumping performance and throwing performance and things like that because you're still using your entire body. But then as we get into competition, there's things that work and things that don't work. So it's like, okay, we're gonna move light, we're gonna move fast, we're gonna be powerful,
Yeah.
and y- sometimes we try to keep. I mean, at least in my case, we're not doing a lot of bilateral movements because of the asymmetries. Um, so maybe early in the year we're using true single leg, single arm type patterns, and
Yeah.
then when we need to move a little bit faster, closer to comp, closer to
Yeah.
championship type time, then we might move to something that's like split stance or something
Yeah.
like that. So there's still double leg support, but you're getting more bias to one side than the other. Um, again, kind of smaller changes like that, but it's nothing. At least like from a coaching perspective, it doesn't seem like it's anything super drastic. Again, I've never had the feeling that I'm like completely overhauling
Hmm.
programs or changing things for that type of stuff. Because again, it's you know the principles of the sport remain. But the conversation you're just talking about, that's really really cool. Like I said, and that's like anything. You're watching the video, you're looking at this, and you're going, okay, how can we change that? And it's really cool to see the depth that stuff can go into, and how creative from a coaching standpoint, both strength conditioning, tactically, technically, that you can dive into this stuff. And I think it's awesome to see and to hear about.
Oh yeah. It's kind of like we said earlier, like all of it is so new, especially on the wheelchair front, that everything's cutting edge at this stage. And you're
Yeah.
bringing in people from cycling, like we're bringing in people from like Triathlon Canada who work with the bikes, like the bike mechanic people, and we've learned even about like tire pressure because we just assumed, oh yeah, we wanted to pump the tires nice and heavy, and they're like, oh no 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 no, you don't want a super firm tire. So what happens with the super firm tires? It digs into the track more and creates more friction.
It is a balance.
So we actually went with a more deflated tire because it's more spread and flat on the track. And they're like, oh yeah, it makes a way bigger difference when you're going around the corner. And the coach was playing with them. They're like, holy crap, like such a simple thing that gives you 2% of performance.
Well, and you laugh
Which
because you're talking
when
about the motorsport. It's the same way, right? The more deflated the tire is, the more it helps you in the turns.
yeah,
But you pump up the tire a little bit and it's stiffer, it's a little easier on the straightaways. So if you're, like you said, if you're dealing with the bend and the
oh yeah,
straight, then you're trying to find what's the balance in the tire pressure that's And that's something, hey, the NSCA textbook has nothing about that
No.
in all the all the information. And like that's I mean, it's just, this is cool stuff that you're getting to do.
Well, and it's going elements of, I don't know if anyone's seen, have you ever seen the gloves that they hit the chair with?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about them, so I'm sure there's all kinds of technological things going on in there that, you know, the lay person is not
Surprisingly,
aware of.
yes, again, it depends where the conversation goes in terms of who you're talking to. But essentially, the basics of how they hit into the wheel. So you got the flat wheel, and there's a rim on it that probably sticks
Yeah.
out about an inch, roughly, and it's depending on the material. It's usually a rubber rim that's fully coated, and you can like take out the inside to save weight, whatever the conversation, and then you hit it with a glove. So essentially, imagine a rubber MMA glove, but instead of the padding being on the knuckles, all the materials on the inside, because that's what they're hitting with
Yeah,
is
so you
the
can
inside of the fist to push onto the wheel. And one of the conversations we had with our athlete is, hey, do we want to use different gloves for different events? Because our athlete races the 100, the 400, the 800. So in terms of event, it's a pretty broad classification. And we're talking about conversation like Formula One, like you have wet tires, you have dry tires, like you have more cornering tracks, you have more top speed tracks. So we're starting to have the conversation now of, okay, do we have an 800 glove versus a 100 glove? And then do we have a 100 rain glove versus a 100 sun glove? So like these are the conversations that are starting to happen now, where it's like, okay, is it going to be rubber covered in suede because that's what our athlete uses now? And for him, he likes that because the suede doesn't get influenced by the weather. So if it's really humid, he has no issues holding onto the rim. But then you see some folks at Worlds in the 100-meter T34s. There's a guy who came rocketing out at the beginning of the race. Like he was 5 meters above everyone, 10 meters in. Like, holy crap, like what happened? But then you hear the commentators talking, they're like, oh yeah, he uses um it was a type of fabric glove that gives him lots of grip into the wheel. So they're like, oh, it's great on the acceleration. But then as soon as they got past 60 meters, he started to fall back. So the glove gave him the ability to push into the wheel with longer impulses, but once the impulses got shorter and shorter and shorter in terms of the time
it's
demand,
tougher to
he started to struggle. So it's like that conversation of like, okay, like how do we manage like the pros and the cons of each glove to maximize the pros and the cons of each event? So it's an interesting conversation when you're talking about this kind of like almost like a technology race to an extent on the wheelchair side of how do we manage what we have versus the events constraints versus the individual constraints to figure out like the equipment that works best. It's cool to be a part of.
yeah, and that to me is like the cool thing with what you're doing is that, yeah, I'm probably still going to stand by my statement that 95% of what you
Oh,
do
totally.
is exactly the same, but the 5% that's different, like it's pretty damn cool.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? It's
Well,
not different in a bad way or a challenging way. It's just like it's cool. And it's cool that you get to be involved in that and kind of see it up close. Because again, if you end up going and coaching anywhere else, doing anything else, these are experiences and learnings that you're going to take with you. And it's making
yeah.
you a better coach, a more adaptable coach along the way.
Yeah, it's only just changed the constraints, right? It's no different if you look at what's going on with some of the US track and field. Have you seen the exogen stuff that's going on down there? The wearable
Yeah.
resistance?
Yeah, there's like the technology world is moving so fast that it's so hard to keep up with it now.
It's interesting. So I had a conversation with that guy in Vegas when I was at the NSCA conference because he had
Okay.
a stand set up, and that this whole like wheelchair constraints changing the skill thing remind me of it. But this applies to the ambulatory side, so it's not as simple as, hey, we're just gonna throw some weight on your shin and run. But they're using like constraints based approach learning stuff now, where it's, hey, we're gonna position the weight in this way with maybe because all the weights are sort of like teardrops. So there's a really light end and then a heavier end.
Yeah, so it creates those inertial patterns.
Yeah. So he was talking about like, oh yeah, when we're doing acceleration stuff, we'll put the teardrop close to the foot. He's like to drive the shank low towards the ground and have that pistoning action. He's like, we just use it. It's not like a throw on 20 pounds and just run. It's like a, hey, we're gonna position the weight in this way to pull this range of motion this way and like constraint specific approach. that's a cool thing to see in terms of how you adapt constraints to improve like the technical model. And that was just something that kind of reminded me of like something you'd use more on the running side.
Yeah, and again, like constraints modeling, like that's again, that's a principle. Those are theories that, apply across the board to a wide variety of movements, and you can use resistance is just a type of constraint you can use. You can use, virtually anything can be a constraint if it influences how the individual is going to move. You can put a constraint in place and influence and try to steer them towards the desired the desired movement. And so, yeah, I mean, all that stuff to me is like super cool. And I mean, I'd be curious to hear about maybe some of the challenges or the barriers you've found, maybe like personally coaching them. I don't imagine you've probably found too many. Again, you're a smart coach, you're creative. I'm sure there were like initially like, oh, that's not going to work, but here's my solution. And it just
Yeah.
requires you to do things differently. But I know across the board and in parasport in general, there can be some barriers, constraints, and things that make it more difficult for like the athletes, the coaches, and everybody involved. So, you talked a little bit about the space as being one of them.
Yeah, I would say of things that were hard, can we allude to a bit before, space has been the biggest thing. And I think space is the biggest difference maker working on the para side that we've made so far. Because in terms of like the actual coaching and the movement, okay, certain classifications have a little bit more of like a learning turnover time. Some classifications maybe are less comfortable with certain type moves. So like the biggest example I can think of is our two VI athletes that we have aren't super comfortable in the air, but they have limited peripheral vision. They don't see the ground. Like that makes sense. So, but it's no different than anyone who's just bad at jumping. Like they function very similarly. But the space has been like a key to unlock a lot of stuff for us. So our space wasn't built with para in mind. It was built with able-bodied rugby and rowing in mind. That was the original design of the space. That's the groups who were there. And then over the years, the groups have just moved and changed. So now it's mostly para in our facility. But we've got, again, like I said, black floors with black platforms. So all the things kind of blend in together. So if you
Yeah, it
have
looks the
VI
same.
athletes, yeah, especially with VI athletes who have limited vision, where it's like they can't see that difference. So then we started putting orange tape around. And then there was one side of our gym, you could only ambulate in one side of the gym. The other side of the gym, you had to like step over weight racks and step over platforms and dodge barbells. So we've given one of our guys 2 stitches in his eyes because he
Oh,
hit a barbell because he was trying to navigate around the space. So we ended up going and readjusting one half of the gym and turning off platforms. And we created a 3-foot alleyway for them to walk into that space. So now they could access the main lifting area from both ends.
yeah, you're not.
And our one VI athlete was like, "Oh, Christian, this walkway's great because I can just go. So you don't have to worry about hitting stuff."
Yeah, they
It's like,
trust
so
the
nice.
space and the environment around them way more.
Yeah. And that's the thing is like with our one VI athlete, in a space he knows, you would never guess he's blind. It's when he's in a place that's got lots of obstacles that he's unfamiliar with. So that's even something like keeping the gym clean makes a huge difference for him. So if there's stuff scattered around, or if there's just lots of people in the gym and weights are kind of around, you can see he starts to sort of like look. He tries to look at the ground with his feet and make sure he's not stepping on equipment, right? Like so, little things
Yeah,
like
they're
that make
taking more
such a
time
difference.
to take in what's going on around them or take in the environment to see, is it
Yeah,
safe for me to move here? Can I go here? Is that in the
yeah,
way? Is that not in the way?
yeah. And then that like that opening up that 3-foot gallery to access the main lifting area has made a huge difference to the wheelchairs as well, because if the cable stacks also block the other entryway. So again, like we talked about with my T51 athlete, if I've got 4 25-kilo plates stacked and his wheelchair and all the stuff set up, like you can't get in that side.
Yeah.
So honestly, like the facility has been the biggest limiter, and designing facilities with accessibility in mind is a huge, huge piece that I don't think anyone really talks about when they're really thinking like how we can design the space flow. Just throw stuff into a gym, and I feel like every gym's got that corner that's just like kind of the shit corner where all your random pieces of equipment are just jammed into the corner of the gym. Like everyone's got that.
Yeah.
Every gym's got that. now having had that corner and seeing how negatively it impacted our facilities being able, like our athletes being able to access the equipment, it's like that's a huge no-no. It's like just have everything breathe and have space and maybe have a little bit less open space. But if you can at least navigate the space, like it doesn't matter at that stage.
Yeah. Have you found in your experience that, like, do you have a lot of machines in there? Do you find the machines like helpful? Is that something that, provides more stability or, kind of less nuance? Like, I'm just thinking, like, you talk about the VI athlete and they don't like
Yeah.
to jump. My first thought was, man, they would love to hop on our Kaisers because they could just let it
Yeah.
rip. You don't have to worry about leaving the ground and you are inside what would be a known, well, once you got to know it, probably a known and comfortable environment where you could feel it. Okay, here's the top, here's the bottom, here's the platform. Once you're locked in and ready to go, it's like, okay, I can just like blast off. Here we go. Because I know that the Kaiser machines have actually been very helpful, at least in my end,
Yeah.
for this type of stuff.
Yeah. We haven't used a ton. We don't have the space for it. Like we're a quite small gym.
Okay, I just
Um,
wasn't sure what was already in there, if
yeah.
there were some
I would
machines or
love.
whatever.
Yeah. So we had a couple things like cables. We have like a hammer strength row machine, which for the wheelchair athletes is actually awesome because we have a prone row bench. But same thing, the prone row bench is like 6 feet tall.
Yeah,
So I have a hard time getting on it. So now let's try to like get someone from a chair onto the 6 foot tall bench. Like it's so difficult.
yeah, you gotta like lift somebody up or do that. Like it's
Oh.
yeah,
So we use the like the seated hammer strength row a lot for that because that's super accessible. Because they just have to hop off. It's not this ridiculously tall hammer strength bench that we have. I don't know why someone ever made it so tall. But yeah, something like the hammer strength would be good. A lot of the jumping stuff, I've just started using VBT as a feedback loop for them,
okay,
where it's like, hey, I just want you to create a bigger number when you're doing this jumping exercise. And I'll read the number off to them of like 1.2, 1.25. And I'm cueing them to focus on the number. Don't worry about the jumping space. Just focus on the number, get the number higher. And that's been a pretty good feedback loop for me, probably similar to what the Kaiser
okay,
would do.
yeah. That's why I was just curious because like over the years, I've never been a big fan of like machines in
Mhm.
general. I've always thought that's better for gen pop, bodybuilding, kind of whatever. But I think as the mad scientist in me has slowly started to, kind of come out over the years of coaching, I'm starting to get more and more creative with seeing machines. And this is probably, as a certified coach, I probably shouldn't say this, but there's the label on the machine that says use it this
Yeah.
way. And I'm looking at that going, this is probably the only way I'm not going to use this machine,
Yeah.
as it was quote unquote safely intended. And you're constantly, at least I find myself constantly looking at machines now going, oh, you could do this with that. You could do that. You could, I mean, our Kaiser squat machines, they're designed just to squat on. There's
Yeah.
probably like 15 different exercises we do on them
Yeah.
because it's like, whatever. We're trying to get creative. So that's where I wasn't sure if, at least one of my first thoughts with, para athletes is, okay, how can we kind of MacGyver or Jimmy rig some of these machines to make them potentially really useful training tools
Yeah.
for the athletes? Because again, like you were mentioning, they might provide some stability or level of comfort or experience where the machine doesn't change. It stays the
Yeah.
same. So then you got a good thing you're comfortable with and you can let it rip. So that's where I was just curious if kind of you found machines to be helpful. Because like I said, I've used our
Yeah.
Kaiser machines for almost everything but squatting, um, to kind
But
of
it's a
do
squat
some
machine
different
tough.
things. Yeah, I know. And I, again, if somebody got hurt doing something that wasn't a squat, I'd probably be on the chopping block and my days of Guelph would be over. But um, it, that's where I was just curious. And those are unfortunately the only machines that we have. We have the
Yeah.
GHDs as well, which I've, Jimmy rigged at times to turn into leg
Mhm.
curls and leg extensions and other things that again they're not designed for.
Yeah, use it for
Um,
more core stuff than anything at this stage. Then glute ham development.
Yeah, or like the reverse hypers or whatever. Like there's a million different things where I'm doing with them. So that's where I was curious in your experience if you have any machines in there and if you've done stuff like that.
Yeah, I would love to have some Kaiser squats and things like that. I mean, we talked about it before. The stimulus is what's going to dictate the adaptation.
Yeah, well, and that's why, and to me, you can still get stimulus out of machines, even if they've been, you know, for lack of
Non-functional,
a better
whatever that
word,
means in the
yeah, they've been
world.
demonized by the industry because, like you said, not functional.
Yeah. Well, it's that conversation. Like you're seeing a comeback of machines. Like I know there's an S&C coach in the NBA who's using a lot of machines when they're traveling. And he's like, it's great. They don't have to think about it. They get the stimulus to get the adaptation we want. It's a globally low stress. It's like, why wouldn't we use machines in the NBA? Like it makes a lot of sense for our guys. I'm like, oh, that's a really good point. Like that makes a lot of sense. And then you're looking at, okay, like let's talk about some of the coordination athletes. If you've got like cerebral palsy or brain trauma, again, a lot of the things that we typically see is one-sided deficiency. So like
Yeah.
their balance will struggle a lot, or they have less strength on the one side. So when we're talking about, okay, one side's got lack of balance and stability, if we're doing anything unilateral, even bilateral, that requires any sort of balance, it's going to influence output. And if
And
we're
we don't want to
having
influence the output.
no, if the output's diminished, then we're not getting the adaptation we want in terms of like, hey, how am I going to
Exactly.
get this 1500-meter running faster, this 400-meter running faster? But we can't improve the output because they're limited by balance. Dude, like the Kaiser squat machine is the perfect solution because we
Well, and
create
that's where
incredibly
like
stable.
it's been a godsend for us on that front.
Yeah. Well, and then you can do like unilateral rate of force development work because
We've done a
otherwise
little
it's
bit of
too
that too.
unstable. Yeah. Like otherwise you're too unstable. And that's where you can develop some like deficiencies left and right, like some of those imbalances without having to worry
Or the
about like,
imbalance
oh, are they,
begins to grow.
yeah.
I mean, probably one of the biggest things we accomplished this year was diminishing that
Hmm.
disparity between the two sides. It's never going to be a one to
The same.
one.
No.
That's just not going to happen. But if it can be, you know, 1 to 80 rather than, or like, 100 to
Yeah.
80 rather than 100 to 50, that's a
Yeah.
that's a big win.
Yeah. And using the machine affords them the opportunity to actually develop that capacity in that affected limb because they're
Yeah,
not worried about balancing or stabilizing or falling over on their face. Like they're just like, okay, I can just push, like, let it out as hard as
exactly.
I can.
Exactly.
So that's a huge piece. Yeah. And I like that idea of like Kaiser squat machines. Again, some of you look at like just squat. Like some of the more traditional coaches out there are like, just do a squat and squat fast. Like there's a lot of utility of this tool that opens up a lot of doors for a lot of people that you don't think about.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where, I mean, obviously, I guess a little bit of the barrier there. There's, money constraints. I mean, even
Yeah.
like regular machine. I mean, the Kaisers are expensive because they're pneumatic, but I mean, even just a regular, like you walk into a regular Gen Pop gym and you look at all the
Yeah.
machines. I mean, those things are still
Thousands of
1,500,
dollars.
2,000, like thousands of dollars we're talking about per machine. So to outfit a place with all the machines that you could want could still be a tremendous amount of money. Um, I don't know. Have you found, like, I guess the last barrier kind of thing, like a lack of studies and like
Oh,
information? And I feel like so much that happens on the para side, at least again in the small case studies that I had to deal with, but you're in it way more, is that like you're going off of experience and intuition and gut and feel rather than, and not that everything has to be derived from a scientific study, but
no,
you don't have, at least I find, as much available, if any.
not at all. Like there's like the way I've utilized the research is trying to understand a little bit more of the physiological underpinnings to certain things, especially on the coordination side or the spinal cord injury side. Because there's certain considerations that we really careful of. So our T51 wheelchair athlete, he was a spinal cord injury. I think he car accident when he was young or something like that. He can't sweat. So he doesn't have any mechanisms to cool himself down.
Hmm.
So when you're talking about like being in Victoria, BC with a guy who can't sweat in 30-degree heat in the summer in a chair and he's just out there baking. So like so there's certain things like that the research has been super helpful for. It's like, okay, what strategy can we do? So we have a spray bottle. We just like spray him down between laps on the
Just
track to cool
yeah.
him off. Like we're his sweat mechanism. So things of understanding, okay, like maybe some of the cerebral palsy athletes. It's okay. What are the neuromuscular mechanisms
Mm,
underpinning this? How does that influence training as much? And one of the things we found is like exposure to intensity tends to fatigue them a lot more. So we're a little
oh
bit
yeah, definitely.
less. So a lot of our approaches are more volume driven with bits of intensity sprinkled in less often. I'd say is the biggest change. Like that's anecdotal, our experiences. That's not really research driven. And there's research stuff in Gen Pop around some of these things, but in elite athlete populations is different because we're talking about people trying to throttle that line of how much work can I do and improve without falling off the cliff and either overtraining or breaking.
Yeah.
So it's like it's not the same, right? Like when we're talking about 800-meter runners, if you've got a study where it's like we have elite 800-meter runners, and I made this comment to a colleague the other day because I was reading a study. It's like, oh yeah, we did this intervention on elite 800-meter runners about plyometric training and improving performance, and the people were running 155, and I'm like, in no world is 155 an elite male 800-meter time.
Not even close.
Like you're not even on Team Canada's roster as like the lowest classification as a 155 guy.
Yeah, like
Like
that's like
people
high
like
school level.
Marco Arop is running 143, and he's not even a medalist, and he's one of the best Canadian 800-meter runners, and he's incredible. The dude's won Diamond League races before. He's
Yeah.
running 143 or 142, and like, so it's for me the literature around parasport is the same issue. You're doing studies in Gen Pop and trying to say, oh yeah, this applies to elite sport. It doesn't apply. It's not the same thing.
Yeah. No, and that's been something I think that's you know probably lacking, and I think my hope is that and so I don't know if I've had more exposure to parasport in the sense that it seems to be popping up everywhere I go. I see
Yeah,
things about parasport, the world champs that were in Paris just recently
yeah,
saw a lot about that. I don't know if it's because I'm like very partially involved. I
hmm
don't know if it's because the Google machine spies on me and then my Google feed on my phone knows that I'm in track and field environments and figures this is track and field, you'll like this. Or if there is actually becoming like a notable change in the recognition, the awareness, and the exposure of parasport, particularly in our case, para
yeah,
athletics. And it's probably a combination of all three.
yeah,
Um, hopefully not as much of the middle one with the Google machine spying on me. Um, but and I think that's a positive move that it has more
100%.
exposure because the greater the exposure is, then the more likely we're to have research, the more likely we are to maybe be developing new machines or training equipment that satisfies or meets certain demands that parasport needs while staying true to the principles and the outcomes of the sport. And so I think right now we're probably in a time where I think collectively there's probably a better job being done at the highest level than there ever
Yeah,
has been with exposure and generating um, you know excitement and awareness for that type of sport. um, the side I think we could probably do better is I still think we need to have more explicit um like yeah, we work with para athletes, or para athletes are welcome, they're invited, we can train these people. I feel like there's an inherent kind of barrier with, if unless it's explicitly stated like, hey, you can come try this sport, then if you have an environment full of able-bodied people, it very much gives the impression that you would have to be able-bodied to
yeah,
be involved in that. And so I think that's probably the next step across the board where we could probably collectively, I think this is more maybe at like a community club
yeah,
kind of introductory level, where I think the more education, the more training that people can get on working with Parasport, the better, because I think there's a lot of ways that Parasport can be integrated into the current sports system. And that's a little bit the setup we have at Guelph. I mean, the few people
Yeah,
that we have that are in Parasport, they're mixed in and amongst everybody. But we don't have like a specific thing that says, hey, we're able to do the following. If you're in
yeah,
Parasport, you're still cool to be here. And so maybe that's kind of the next step, at least from my experience, is that we maybe need to be more explicit and active with our, invitation and welcoming of
yeah.
Parasport in the environment. I don't know if there's anything that, like, I don't know. That's kind of my closing thought, I think, to kind of help grow and create awareness for Parasport. Again, you're in it more than I am, in the sense of not case study, N of one, N of two. You're working with, larger groups and organizations. So I don't know if is that something that's echoed? Is that,
I
you
would
know,
agree with that statement. Like I think it is growing. And I kind of mentioned that like we're in this golden well of para development, I think in general is like parasport just growing and exploding a little bit because it's starting to get more airtime on TV. It's starting to become more accessible in terms of viewership. Like Para Worlds for track and field is aired on YouTube, which is fantastic. It was
that
super
was
easy to
huge,
watch. It was
huge.
awesome, right? Like in a sport like track and field, it's already really hard to watch at the best of times. I'm hoping with the tension and the growth, it creates better opportunities for some of the para athletes in terms of money, especially because when we're talking about athletics, opportunity to earn doesn't exist very often. And we had our athlete, um, world champion, world record holder, Olympic champion, 1500-meter event. Very, very successful athlete, very high level athlete. He couldn't get a shoe sponsorship. He was like making social media posts about being like, he's like, I can't become like an ambassador for like a shoe company, let alone get a sponsorship. He's like, in what world on the able-bodied side is someone going to be the world champion, Olympic champion, world record holder, and not have a shoe deal?
Oh,
Like that's ridiculous.
they'd be on a huge, huge contract.
Yeah, massive. So like so he actually made a bit of a wave with that because he posted and critiqued, and I think it was on CBC and some of that stuff, which was awesome to see people bring awareness to that because like you can be 100th of the world and have huge shoe deals on the able-bodied side. So I think some of like the bigger organizations need to take note and make more of an effort around like, hey, we need to financially support these athletes because like they're incredibly talented, successful athletes who are doing amazing things. No, like the disparity between the two is there. So that's a big push for me. I would say on that side is like the financials need to start coming along with it, like with and hopefully with the sport getting more airtime and with the popularity growing. I hope that starts to happen more and more. Where like these folks can at least get sponsorships. Like, guys, come on, what are we doing here?
Yeah, no, like you said, I would agree. I think it's, things are trending in the right direction. Hopefully it moves, you know, more rapidly than it does slowly, because I think that's for the betterment of everybody, that it moves in the right direction
Yeah,
faster. But I think, like you said, we're probably in a bit of a golden age here where
yeah,
this could be the time to really kind of make a difference for that, and kind of get it on level playing field, in the sense that,
yeah,
they're, everything's, equal, for, lack of a better
yeah.
word.
Well, I think like if athletes can then come in and make a living and pay their bills doing sport, like you said earlier, that's going to drive the popularity. It's going to have a trickle effect where like you can bring more people into parasport, right? Like that's it opens up opportunities and doors to increase the number of participants. No different than any other sport, right? Like sport participation is limited by funding and opportunity. So if funding increases and they increase the amount of opportunities available, more people are just going to do it, right? Similar sort of idea there.
Well, and I mean, I've always said the number one, component of athlete development is to have athletes to develop. And
Yeah,
that mostly happens in your community grassroots
yeah,
level. If you have 100 kids playing a sport versus 100,000 kids playing a sport, you're more likely to find, the athlete who's capable of stepping on the world stage and competing really well, if you have a much larger group of individuals to pick from. So, yeah, the more popular it becomes, and the more that we can, like you said, drive the needle in the right direction, the more the performance and everything is gonna come with it, because the developmental level will provide
Yeah.
such a solid foundation for everything else to be built upon. So
I think
yeah,
that's
man,
really the
that's
next stage. Get them in young, develop them earlier. Because right now, like a lot of para athletes just come in their 20s, maybe into the teens, versus like just start getting them younger and younger, where it's like again, like this golden age of performance is just going to keep growing when we get athletes in at 12 years old versus 25.
yeah, just competing in sport and doing stuff like that. And yeah, no, it's been really cool to kind of hear some of, I mean, we've talked off air about
Yeah.
some of the specifics and stuff like that, but some of the nuanced stuff with like the, the chairs and tire
Oh
pressure
yeah.
and specific mechanics and things like that. I mean, it's really cool to hear about all that stuff. And I mean, hopefully, anyone who's listening, kind of the takeaway is that if there was an opportunity in Parasport and you've never worked with Parasport or anything like that, like it's, again, probably 90% of it's the same. It's coaching, it's,
Yeah.
knowing your principles and, you know, working with individuals, communicating with individuals, and a lot more of it is the same than different. So hopefully this is maybe remove some barriers, or like the, a daunting thing of like, oh, I've never worked with Parasport, so I can't work with Parasport.
Hmm.
Um, good coaches are good coaches. And no
Yeah.
matter what they're in, no matter where they're coaching, a good coach is going to do the job wherever they go.
100% agree. Yeah. Coaching's coaching. If you're good at what you do, it doesn't matter who's in front of you.
I mean, one thing that I think does matter is what you're listening to. Um, do you do you play music when you're in the weight room?
Oh yeah, of course. The
Okay.
speaker's always blaring when we got people in the weight room.
Okay. Are you in charge of that, or are the athletes in charge of that?
It depends on the group. So I've had this
Oh,
conversation with a
okay.
couple athletes actually recently. Because been I've covered for a couple other groups. I've asked the athletes like, oh, like who's the DJ in your group? And they're like, oh, like usually our coaches put some stuff on. Like we don't pick music. I'm like, I always let my athletes pick the music. It also tells me
Yeah,
a
me
lot
too.
about you. If it's a big trust moment, if I'm gonna let you play my playlist, like that's a bit of a personal moment here. Like I'm
Yeah.
learning something about you. So my athletes always put music on. I very rarely DJ. Sometimes I will. If they're like
Okay.
Christian, put something on. I don't have my phone on. Like okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. But some groups of athletes are it's coach only. I'm like come on, open up a little. Let's put some music on.
Okay, because that's where I was curious if you were the DJ for your group, what you had playing for everybody, but it's probably more what have you been listening to individually, not for the athletes to hear because you're not the DJ for your group.
Yeah, I mean I've got one athlete. He's from England. Like he grew up there. He's a Canadian guy. But he grew up in England.
Okay.
Huge drum and bass guy. Him and I kick off swell. It's hard to tell who's DJing between him and I. It's like, oh, who's
I
playlist? I'm like, I
could
actually can't tell the difference between.
I could see that. I could see that.
But no, I've actually been doing a lot of running recently. I'm getting more into the aerobic side of things. To my dismay,
You're going full tracky.
going full tracky, man. Eventually, the plan is to kind of train like a 4.8 guy, probably. Where it's still doing, I'm still doing some sprinting, still doing some speed work, but like I've got a bit of an aerobic engine as well in the background. I know it's shocking, right?
Okay,
I'm
all
gonna get
right,
so
all
skinny.
right.
I'm gonna lose like 20 pounds here.
Yeah, join the club.
But with that, the drum and bass and the trance stuff has been in full force doing the long runs because it's been a bit of a grind for me recently.
You need something to keep the
Yeah.
BPM up.
No. So a good tune that I recently, so a lot of what I've been doing is I just put on like new in trance, new in drum and bass, and just listen it through. So a new in trance song came through. It's called Mesmerized by AC13. Great tune.
That sounds like a random good gem. I've
Yeah.
never heard of
Oh
that
yeah.
song. I've never heard of that group or artist or individual, whatever they are. It
It's still the
sounds
only
good
song
though.
I know by them.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's what a lot of that stuff is, though. You know, one song by one person, and then your playlist of 500 songs
Yeah.
is 500 different groups, artists, individual DJs, whoever.
I'll say this. I feel like you don't get one hit wonders anymore in like popular music genres because everyone's got a writer for the most part now that they just write 13 good songs on an album. I feel like in the EDM world, like trance drum and bass, like you still get one
Yeah,
hit wonders
you
because no one has writers. Like they just do their own thing. So you'll still
yeah,
get
and
like
sometimes it hits. and sometimes it don't.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like I have a lot of songs where it's like I've checked these guys out and I'm like, ugh, like the rest of their stuff is okay, but they got that one banger. And it's like, okay, this
Yeah,
is a sick tune.
and that's what makes it on your playlist, and that's what I mean by
Yeah.
like every, at least for me anyway, for the most part, if you got me to put together a list of 100 songs, drum and bass or house or EDM, it's probably 100 songs by 100 different artists. It's
Yeah, you
probably
might
not
have
a lot
three
of
or four
repeat.
by some classic artists and everything else is different.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out then. You've never led me astray. Every time there's
Hey.
been like a random, like Ubuntu. Remember Ubuntu?
Oh, Ubuntu is a good song. Well, that's what we
That
saw at our
was,
buddy's show there when
yeah,
we went and watched some DJ live. Yeah, that was a good
yeah.
tune.
And
I still have
again,
that one
like
on the playlist.
that's probably from them, like a one-hit wonder. What was the song? Was it Earthquake by Gold Cash? Was that the,
Yeah, Earthquake
yeah,
was a good
another like,
song. Yeah.
yeah, like
I don't
one-hit
know who
wonder.
Gold Cash is. Yeah, not a
Neither do
clue.
I haven't even listened to anything else by them, but that song was dope. So made to the
Yeah.
playlist. So yeah, it's big one-hit wonder thing.
But it's nice to have that. Like that was a huge 70s, 80s thing in like the rock alternative genre. You had all these one-hit wonder bands. Like you had the guy who did Sunglasses at Night. Like that was a one-hit wonder.
Yeah, it's oh yeah, the one-hit wonders are that's yeah, they're always good. They're always good. But yeah, I feel
Okay.
like that's where yeah, you still get a lot of that in EDM, which is kind of nice. It's got like a
Yeah.
nostalgic feel to it.
It feels a little bit more authentic. Like I feel like it's a little bit more them.
It's more human.
Because
There's
it's
trial and
not.
error. It's like, they did some good, they did some bad.
I don't know. It just makes the good songs a lot better in my mind. Like I get to feel that it's a
Yeah.
lot better, anyways, because it's a little bit more authentic. It's a little bit more like I mean, think about your top 100 hits. Like they all
Yeah.
kind of sound the same. Like your
I
pop
know what you
music is
mean.
all fairly similar.
Yeah. No,
And
I
like
hear you.
Taylor
I hear
Swift's
you.
last album compared to Taylor Swift's this album, pretty much the same album.
Yeah, exactly. No, no difference.
And what about you, Tommy? What's going on in the weight room these days when you're doing your calf races on a slant?
No. So I've been trying to listen to a little bit more of the heavier stuff again.
Okay.
So I went back, listened to a little more Meshuggah.
Meshuggah.
Meshuggah, they're a death metal band. Yeah, it's good. It's good stuff.
I'm not gonna lie, with a name like Meshuggah, I've expected R&B or something like that. It's not dark enough of a name for a death metal band.
No, not very dark. I don't know what the word means. Maybe it's like an old Viking word that, fits perfectly. I don't know. Um, but yeah, I mean they're like an like all-time great status.
Yeah.
That's, they don't miss. They don't
I'll have to
miss.
check them out. I haven't listened to much metal recently, so I'll have to go check
It's
out Meshuggah.
heavy. It's heavy. It's
Is it dark? Is it like a don't listen in public kind of band where it's like
I
it's
mean, I
just you
throw
at
it
the
on in
gym?
public because I don't really care, but it's most people wouldn't like it, I don't think. But I love it.
Yeah, like
I
it's a
love
you're
it.
lifting by yourself kind of music versus you're with the whole group and everyone's like, what the fuck's
Yeah, and I mean if I put it on with the whole group there, who cares?
a liar?
We're lifting heavy today. Let's get after it.
Yeah,
So yeah, I was trying to go back and listen to, you know, something heavier, something, like an all time. You can always go back to it. It's always good. So for me, it was Meshuggah.
love it. Nice, excellent,
So yeah, I mean that's another episodes in the book. Fun one to talk about, kind of Parasport.
awesome.
It was great to hear a little bit more about what you're doing specifically day in and day out. And I mean, yeah, always fun to learn, be in new environments. There's some good tidbits of information you gave me that I think will be helpful, and I can try to put into practice, in situations I'm in. And yeah, I mean, always good to learn from one another, and another fun episode of the books.
It was great. No, had some good talking points there, and I'm excited for the next one here.
So yeah, okay. Well, once again, thanks to all the listeners, the viewers, however you end up taking this in. Always fun to have you along for the ride. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and appreciate your support. And we'll see you for the next episode.